I have discovered one of the benefits of doing a sermon series, and that is you can sort of put off the questions until the fourth sermon, right? We'll get to that later. But perhaps you might have some questions that we may be able to at least address from today's sermon. I want to be clear. We are going to study and exegete the Revelation passage. It must be done. We're looking at it theologically, exegetically, and then socially and historically, the passage. And the idea that Christ defeats his enemies in time and in history. I myself don't necessarily die on the hill of being called a post-millennialist. What I do die on the hill of, though, is that Christ defeats his enemies in time and history, whatever you want to call that. John.
Matthew quote that we looked at today. Yes. It's not verbatim.
Right.
So how do you respond to people that want to...
Yeah. Matthew there obviously is using a little bit of interpretive license, if you will. He's taking what Isaiah says and applies it to his present time. One of the things that, and I know I've gotten in some discussions with folks, sometimes people want to take our rules, like we have our quotes, for example. We put quotes around something. You know, it says, well, are you saying it just like he said it? And we have to do that because people mess with things. But oftentimes we see the biblical writers doing things a lot different, especially the Hebrews writer. It says, the writer of the Hebrews is not careful by our standards, because he'll say, someone says in another place. And Hebrews does that all the time. Someone says here, someone says there, and then he says what they say. So the way they refer, oftentimes the New Testament writers, they do it a lot of different ways. Christ at one point actually quotes like the second Psalm, for example. And that's not an exact quote either. But it is an application, and that's what they did all the time. They're basically saying, this is what was said here, this is how it applies. Which I think actually makes it even a little stronger, actually.
In this case, it says that he leads justice to victory, which is way more than what
Isaiah even said.
Isaiah
Yeah. Justice to victory, which is a pretty sweeping statement. And it had to have started at Christ's ministry, unless Matthew's just kind of pulling some passage out of no place. It seems to me. Good question. Someone else? Yes?
I'm just going to add that sometimes they follow the Septuagint more closely than they follow the original Hebrew too. So you have that.
Yeah, they do that, which I was just thinking recently that we need to maybe have a series on bibliology. But there are those that believe that you shouldn't translate the Bible. We should just all learn Greek and Hebrew, for example. But we have that to point out to us that it is legitimate to translate the scriptures into another language. And they did do that at times. They used the Septuagint, which was Hebrew translated into Greek, and then they used that. They did that.
Point that out to boys and girls. What the Septuagint.
Oh yeah. Yeah. All right, kids, who knows what the Septuagint it was? All right. Okay, I'll just real quickly. You see, when Jesus and the apostles lived, pretty much everybody was speaking Greek. Nobody was speaking Hebrew much at all anymore. It just was hardly happening. They're speaking Greek. Well, then, if the Old Testament book, if the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and you don't speak Hebrew, how would you know what it said? So what they did, it's called a Septuagint because they had 70 scholars who knew both Hebrew and Greek, translate the Old Testament Hebrew into Greek so that people could read it. And it's called the Septuagint. And what Conrad just said was sometimes the New Testament writers are actually quoting or referencing the Septuagint and not the Hebrew. They're actually referencing the translation from Hebrew to Greek rather than the actual Hebrew. Raise your hand if that's clear as crystal. Just kidding. We can talk about that talk about that later. But that Septuagint thing is very intriguing because New Testament writers did reference it. Yes? Jeremiah.
I've always been encouraged by that in Isaiah, the passage you quoted, when we talked about a bruised reed you will not break, and thankful that Christ is patient with us. Also try to apply that to my parenting. I'm assuming we can apply it that way, that we should also be, patient with our children.
Well, I think every adult here can say that our parents were patient with us, right? I love that in the case of parenting. I really do. Because parenting can be a delicate thing, right? Right? How do you encourage a child's good things that they do without breaking their spirit, without destroying them? And that happens all the time, with the shut up, which happens, right? And those things that can destroy a child. So I think that seriously applies. Negotiating our way around those reeds to get rid of the things that are bad, that cannot be accepted, but not bruising that reed at the same time. Let that reed grow. It's a delicate process. Another thing I do, maybe this isn't a perfect illustration of that, but another thing I do, how many of you have ever seen those bald eagle cams they have now on the internet? Have you ever seen those things? Are they not pretty cool? Come on. And where I work, since I don't have a real hard job, I sit down a lot, and I have a computer on all the time. And so I have this bald eagle cam on all the time. And the one I watch, there's about 5 or 6 of them, and right now the eaglets still have their downy fuzz on them or whatever. And one of the things that really intrigued me was, the eagles I love birds of prey, but let's face it, bald eagles are nasty. Did you ever see the end of their beak? The way it comes down? They don't just have like a normal beak that pecks for like little seeds and whatnot. That's not the way their beak works. They couldn't pick up seeds if they tried. They got a nasty hook at the end of that beak, which is made for one thing and one thing only: tearing flesh. And that's what they do. And they're nasty. And they will even, getting this too much, but they will even steal fish from other birds. For example, the osprey, which is also a very interesting bird, will give up its catch if a bald eagle flies over. That's all the bald eagle has to do. They're so nasty. If a bald eagle flies over an osprey, the osprey's done all the work, caught the fish. The osprey will immediately drop it, and the bald eagle will, before it hits the ground, the bald eagle dives, grabs the fish, and takes off with it. The osprey has to go back to fishing again, I suppose. Nasty birds. But I watch them around their eaglets, hatchlings, whatever. And they are so super careful. And if you watch them, you can see this. They're like super careful, real careful around their young ones. I thought about that as parents raising children, the care that we need to have around these as they grow. Bruised reed, yeah, no doubt. By the way, if you haven't seen these cams, when I started watching these things back maybe 8-9 years ago, it was black and white, no sound. Now they've got color, they've got sound. Interestingly enough, nature itself, one time, okay, all right, 20 seconds here. If you're into music, you know that music often goes in thirds, right? Da, 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 right? One time I saw this eagle. The other eagle was coming in, and the eagle called out. It just kind of called out, screamed out in kind of like I can't imitate it, but you have to use your imagination. Interestingly enough, it screamed out in 2 different tones. It started out in one tone and then switched to another tone. And the tone that it switched to was a perfect third. Okay. If you're not into music, whatever. But anyway, Take my word for it, the thirds are really important in music. It was interesting to see that. All right, I really got off the track there, didn't I? I was way off. I hope you visit one of those Eagle camps, though. They're really interesting. Who else has a question? All right. Well, we certainly would like to ask you to encourage you to join us in the communion now, and we'll ask